Observation, then interpretation, then application. And application, we're just asking, what's the significance of this in the life of the church, in my own life? How does it apply to me today? And I think that probably most of us have been schooled to just open the Bible and look for application. And that is actually a dangerous way to treat the Bible, because then the Bible really does sort of become a Ouija board. It just means whatever you want it to me today. And what your observations and your interpretations do is give control to your application. And again, it's tempting to just rush to application and want to know, okay, what does this mean for me today? And that's a good question, but you've got to be patient in order to get there. So we want to guard against treating the Bible just as a wax nose that we can sort of shape into whatever we want it to be for myself. And it's our observation and interpretation that protects us against that. So, and these are, so observation, interpretation, application, I would say that's a somewhat artificial distinctions, but it's helpful as you're thinking about how to approach the Bible and how to study it. These are distinctions that are useful, but we can never divorce them from one another. Actually, probably most of your best application will come just as you do your observations and your interpretation. It just sort of flows naturally up out of your observing details in the text and studying it. So we want to keep all those three together. You're always doing all three of them, actually. But in terms of trying to think methodologically, how do I go about this, it's helpful to make those distinctions. And again, the handout that I gave you just sort of fills out each of those steps. What do I do when I'm trying to observe? How do I do interpretation at a basic level and then application questions? So that's just some comments on method. Do you all have any questions about that? And a lot of what the study is designed to do is just flesh that out and guide you in the process of doing observations and then interpreting. Questions? Okay. So that's some introductory comments about method. Now let's move then to the Gospel of John itself. And again, here we're trying to just get before us some introductory comments and thoughts. The first thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the relationship of the Gospel of John to the other Gospels. So there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell us a narrative story of the life and ministry of Christ, so they have that in common. But there are some significant differences, and you can probably, if you're familiar at all with the Gospels, and you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you read John, you probably get the sense right off the bat that this is a little different, from the others. And there's good reason for that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. So the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called Synoptic Gospels. And what we mean by that is simply that they are closely related and interdependent on each other. And if you'll, I don't have a copy of the handout, but the handout with the color handout, if you'll take that out and look at it, and there's somebody, I need a copy. It'd be helpful for me to have a copy. Thanks. So if you'll look at, this is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a portion of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it doesn't matter that you can't read it very well, because the important thing are the different colors. This is what I wanted to illustrate. So it's, I think, Matthew on the left, Mark in the middle, and then Luke. And what I want you to notice here is when we talk about interrelationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we mean is there is clearly exact copies at some level. Okay, so in this, on this handout, the black are those portions of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are uniform to all three. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, exact word for word, case for case, every jot and tittle would be the same. Okay, and then you have some portions, the red, for example, where Matthew and Luke are exactly the same, word for word, jot and tittle the same. And then you have situations where Matthew and Mark, the blue, are exactly the same, word for word, and Luke differs. So this is, as you can, if you just think about it, that raises all sorts of questions, right? Who wrote first and who's copying who? And that's the big question that there's all sorts of discussion about among scholars as to how did this happen, who wrote first, who copied who. Many people think Mark, it's the shortest gospel, was the first, which would make some sense. You've got a short, brief summary of the life of Christ in Mark, and then Matthew and Luke fill in other parables, other accounts, events in the life of Christ, and so they are more expansive. Now, some people think, no, it goes the other way. The longer is first, and then somebody writes a more brief account of the life of Christ. But the point you can, I think, see is Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very closely related. They are dependent literarily upon one another. There is literary dependence. Somebody copied somebody. Okay, and the big question is who copied who and how that. And there's all sorts of discussion about that. But you can, if you do this, and then you add the Gospel of John into the picture, you'll find that there are a few areas of direct agreement, but vast differences. Okay, so John is an independent source literarily. He's not dependent, he's not copying Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, so there are differences from the other Gospels. Now there are plenty of parallels between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four. There are the baptism of Jesus is in all four Gospels. The story of Jesus walking on the water or feeding the 5,000. Certain sayings that are common to all four Gospels. But even there, John doesn't copy the other Gospels word for word. He writes those accounts in his own language. Now, that also produces a lot of challenges as you compare the four and you throw John into the mix. There are questions that come up. For example, cleansing of the temple in Matthew, Mark, and Luke happens very late in the ministry of Jesus, at the triumphal entries, when he comes to Jerusalem at the end of his ministry. It shows up where in the Gospel of John? Chapter 2. So there's question, and people debate this, as to whether were there two cleansings of the temple, which is certainly possible, or does John place that event early in his gospel for theological reasons, which sometimes that happens with events. They're not strictly chronological in every Gospels. It's not a movie camera life of Christ. It is a history, and when you write history, there's some liberty for different arrangements. It's not always strictly chronological. So cleansing of the temple, John recounts 3 Passovers in the ministry of Christ, which makes sense because his public ministry is about 3 years. The other gospel writers just focus on one of those events. The details in the Passion narrative, the time of the crucifixion in particular, seems to be different in John's gospel than in the others. And there's different ways to answer the problem, of when that actually took place. So there are some challenges when you put all these together and then try to look carefully at them and see what's going on. There are challenges that come up, but in the end, I think we can say that they mutually reinforce one another. They are complementary accounts of the life of Christ. John leaves some things out, but he includes some other things that the other writers don't include, and that is actually quite helpful. One other comparative note is just John is deceptively simple. It's when you learn Greek, you always start with the Gospel of John because it's the easiest Greek in the New Testament. It's very simple. Sentence structures are simple. Language is simple. It's real easy, accessible language. But I say it's deceptively simple because John, in his simplicity, actually, I think, has some of the most profound theological depth of all the Gospels. So he paints portraits in really colorful ways that are simply accessible, but there's real depth underneath that simplicity. One commentator said it's shallow enough for a child to wade in, but it's deep enough for an elephant to swim. And I think that's a good way to capture the way John operates. Okay, any questions about what I've said so far? Just the relationship of John to the other Gospels. Does that raise questions at all? Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that somebody copied somebody
Yes.
in the Synoptic Gospels. Since they were all there and heard Jesus speak and all heard the same words, especially in the conversation, and Jesus said that he would send the Holy Spirit who would recall those things to their mind so that they would be able to remember.
Yeah.
Why is that the obvious conclusion that somebody copied somebody?
It's because of the way in which the language is so exact by way of comparison. It's not what you would expect if you had 2 people witness an event and then give independent accounts, where there would probably be some variation in, even if it's slight variation in I use a past tense here, you use a present tense there. What we're saying in these cases where they're exact is they're exact. They are word for word, letter for letter, case for case. So because of that, it's apparent that there's a kind of copying that is taking place, a literary dependence because of the exact nature of it. Yeah.
Can you give us rough ideas about dates of the different writings?
Yes, I was going to address that in a minute. But John is the latest of the Gospels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke are, there's discussion about this, but let's say pre-70 AD in the 50s, 60s, and John is probably post-70 AD, more like 90 or 100 AD. And I'll mention that again in a moment. Did I see another hand? thought there was another. Okay. All right, so that's John in comparison to the other. Oh my goodness, is it really? Okay, we're not going to get through everything. Okay, quickly then, when we think about again comparing the John to the other gospel writers, John leaves out certain things that the others include. For example, he leaves out the birth narrative. He leaves out the temptation of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus. There are no parables per se in the Gospel of John. No account of the transfiguration. No casting out of demons. No institution of the Lord's Supper. And not that theme of the kingdom of God it comes up in John's Gospel, but it's not central as it is in the other Gospels. John adds or includes large sections of teaching of Jesus that are unique to John, particularly John 13 to 17. The changing of water into wine in chapter 2, the conversation with Nicodemus, the resurrection of Lazarus. Those are all things that are included in John but not found in the other gospel writers. John uses a lot of symbolism: light and darkness, life, truth, water, sight and blindness. He's one of the things, again, this is that masking simplicity, that he is the master of sort of the double meaning of ideas and terms. And one thing I'll just say on the front end with that is, when you come across these images that John uses to describe Christ and his ministry, Lamb of God, temple, water, judge, bread, these things, just think immediately, ask the question, where is this in the Old Testament? Because it's all there. I mean, one of the things that you'll find is John is writing a commentary on the Old Testament. That's largely what he's doing. And that's, I think, largely what the New Testament writers do in general. But his imagery, some people historically said John is a Greek philosopher using Greek ideas and trying to cast the gospel in Greek form. But I think that theory just doesn't, it has not sustained the evidence, because all his images are Old Testament images. And that'll help you, I think, get at what the meaning of John's gospel is. What is he doing? Okay, in 5 minutes or less, setting and purpose. Again, this is introduction, background introduction. The gospel is written by the Apostle John. That's not John the Baptist. They're two different people. We know he was a fisherman. He was from a Jewish background. He may have been from a wealthy family. John 19:27 mentions his mother's house being a fairly large house, which means he may have come from a family with some means. He was not formally educated, at least not as the rabbis. Acts 4:13. He, along with the other apostles, is accused of being an uneducated man. He writes the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. It's likely that John's Gospel, as I said, was written after 70 AD. And the reason why that's what happens in 70 AD.
Destruction.
Yeah,
the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's critical. That's a critical piece of historical evidence, because in chapter 2, right coming out of the gate, John presents Jesus as the replacement of the temple. So as the Jews are wrestling with, what do we do now without a temple, part of the message of John's gospel is, you don't need a temple. The temple has been fulfilled. The purposes of the temple have been fulfilled in the person and work of Christ. So it's likely that it was written after 70 AD. He's presented in the gospel as an eyewitness. There's a long tradition that says he wrote this from the city of Ephesus. There's very early Christian testimony that John wrote his gospel from Ephesus. So one possible scenario is that John embarks on a ministry of preaching and teaching for a time among Jewish peoples in a Greek city, and probably the other gospels are in circulation. It would be hard to believe that within a Christian community John wouldn't have known about the other gospels. He seems to have known about them. But, as he's preaching and teaching with his own personal emphases and accents, people are going, hey, this supplements what we are reading in these other gospels. It would be really useful if you would write this down. And so John, under the inspiration of the Spirit, writes down the things that he has been preaching and teaching. And it's a complement to what is found in the other gospels. All right, let me try to wrap up by just turning to John 20:31, which whenever you're studying a book of the Bible, it's nice to fish around for a purpose statement. Not all the books of the Bible have a clear purpose statement, but John is helpful in that he gives us a purpose statement. John 20:31, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. Now notice, the question is not, who is Jesus? The question is, who is the Christ? And the answer is, Jesus is the Christ. So the question is, who is the Messiah? And he's written this to provide an answer to that question. Now that's not a question that Christians ask. Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah. It's a question that Jewish folk ask. So it's probably sort of a target for a Jewish audience, giving an answer to the question, who is the Messiah? Who is the Christ? And the answer is going to be Jesus, and that's why this book is so filled with Old Testament connections, trying to flesh out for a Jewish audience, at least initially, who the answer to the question, who is the Messiah? Who is the Christ? And the answer is going to be Jesus is the Messiah. Now, it doesn't mean that this book isn't profitable for non-Jewish people, because once you see what John's doing, it's incredibly useful for the church at large to understand the significance of the work of Christ in light of all of God's plans and purposes to redeem his people. So, probably written for a Jewish audience, but of great benefit for the church. And then I also gave you an outline, a proposed outline for the Gospel of John that I think is just helpful to kind of orient yourself. And this is, again, it's not my independent work. This is the work of many who've seen the Gospel this way. But simple structure, there's a prologue, John 1 through 18, introducing the Gospel as a whole. The book of signs, in chapters 1 through 12, one of the things that comes up over and over, if you just do a concordance search, a concordance just tells you where a word in the Bible is found anywhere else in the Bible. So you can go to Bible Gateway is a really helpful Bible study app or a site online, and you just type in the word sign, and it'll immediately list everywhere in the Bible where that term shows up. And then you can click on the Gospel of John, and it'll show you, and you can just see it. It's in 1 through 12, over and over and over and over and over, mention of the signs that Jesus is doing. And the end of chapter 12 says, after Jesus performed all these signs in their presence, they still wouldn't believe. So it's back to the purpose statement. There are 7 signs with interspersed discourses by Jesus. And then in the second half, the book of glory, 13 through 20, glory becomes a major theme. And again, you can just run it through the concordance and you see how that mention of glory is at the center of the second half of the book. So book of signs, book of glory, and then a closing epilogue. So that's a simple, quick structural outline that just kind of orients you to the book as a whole. And I need to stop. Any questions before you all break out into your discussion groups?
I just have one on the whole relationship of John to Jesus. Are you going to touch on that later? The disciple, how he refers to himself throughout the gospel.
I don't know that shows up anywhere else. I think it's authorial modesty. The disciple whom Jesus loved. I think he is being coy there. He doesn't want to call attention to himself in inappropriate ways, but at the same time he's narrating his own, personal relationship to Christ. So I think it's a sense of appropriate modesty. Any other quick questions? All right. Well, we're excited for y'all jumping in. Let us know if as you get into this, if you have problems or questions or feedback, let us know. And one thing I'd say is I know it's a lot of work in terms of the questions, but don't feel like you have to answer every question. If you have time to dip into a few questions along the way to hit some highlights, that's fine. Just jump in and do what you can. But we tried to structure it so that you have a little bit to do each day of the week. So your devotional time can be in the Gospel of John. All right, get to it.